Hey all, it's Charlotte Appleton with Cesare Project. Today's question is, have you ever noticed that when talking about disease, it's implied that we're talking about living systems? Disease only applies to life. We don't use the word disease when talking about non-living systems like rocks or buildings. Granted, we do say those things age or deteriorate, crumble or fall apart, which in many ways sounds like what disease means today. All that notwithstanding, disease as it's commonly used is a condition of life. When we don't know what life is and can't define it, well, how can we understand what disease is as a condition of life? When you stop and think about it, not only do we fail to define what life is, we really don't have a definition for disease either. Disease is really an irreversible habit that the body or mind has established, and we don't know why that habit has been established, nor how to intervene on it sufficiently enough to reverse it or break that habit. And therefore, chronic diseases remain chronic because we can't bring an end to them in an individual or in a population. Given that we can't explain life, then how do we currently deal with the relationship between life and disease? Let's explore and find out. Be sure to check out CesareProject.com. In the Meet the Founders section, you can learn a little bit more about my story and that of my colleague, Stephen Best, the co-founder of this project. To start this exploration, I did an internet search. I started simply looking for life and disease. This is a very broad search, and the first AI overview that comes up jumps right into lifestyles and risk factors, preventative care, etc. This doesn't answer my question, which is, what is the relationship between life and disease as a condition of living? Further down, we see lifestyle disease, impact of lifestyle on health, lifestyle diseases, and here we see living with a chronic condition. So that's a little bit different. The previous entries indicated more of a risk factor focus, whereas this one starts to get into the experience of disease. And so when we are talking about life, yes, disease is an experience, but that still doesn't answer the question of what's the relationship between life and disease. Here's a link, The Life of a Disease, published in The Lancet. This takes us to what appears to be a book synopsis, The Life of a Disease. The approach here is to think of the biography of disease as if it has its own sort of personal history. It states, do diseases share the birth to death contours of an ordinary life, or perhaps the emotional and intellectual aspects of an extraordinary life? So this sounds like it's trying to personify disease as if it's a separate entity from the living system. This is one approach to dealing with disease that is common today. While this does capture the notion that disease arises from a living system, it has a little bit of a separate feel to me. It goes on to comment that if diseases have lives like ours, their comprehension is easily within our grasp. But on the other hand, what if diseases don't have lives like ours? What if diseases are nothing like human life? This again personifies it as a separate entity that is almost coexisting with us somehow. What if diseases are nothing like human life? That doesn't make any sense to me because diseases are a part of human life. They're inextricable from it. When someone dies and undergoes an autopsy, you can't just take the disease out and examine it separately. It's part of the living system or that which was previously living. It's a quality of an organ or a system which is now no longer living. That begs an interesting question that if disease is a condition of a living system, is it still technically disease after that living system dies? I don't know. Today we think of it that way, but that doesn't necessarily make it so. This is as far as I go in this synopsis, but it illustrates that we're not thinking of disease as a condition of living. It's more like a product of it. That might sound like splitting hairs, so let's just keep going and see what else we can find. We find more links about life with chronic disease, life expectancy, preventing and treating. There's a lot of overlapping concepts here. This first video, My Life with a Chronic Disease, is talking about the experience of disease. When we're talking about life, there is an experience associated with it, for sure. Scientifically, it's seen as irrelevant. Disease is an objective process that is unfolding in time, whereas the experience of that actually really doesn't relate. We know in medicine that it is important, but we treat them as two separate tracks: the subjective feeling of disease and the objective process and outcome of that disease. This video tackles life expectancy and major chronic diseases, which again is focusing more on the process-oriented side of disease, and preventing and treating chronic diseases that ties back into lifestyle choices and risk factors, ends up in this gooey mess that connects life and disease through this fog of, well, how they actually relate. Down here it gets into the early life origins of disease, living with chronic illness. So again, we see a lot of overlapping concepts with this very broad search I used, life and disease. This also interestingly leaps right into human disease. Animals and plants get disease too, and in that case, none of this applies. I did this search in multiple search engines, including Bing, DuckDuckGo, Brave, Firefox, and Chrome, and they all bring up the same hodgepodge of concepts that lead with this lifestyle concept and risk factors when we talk about life and disease. Let's ask a more specific question. What is the relationship between life and disease? And again, in the Google search, we come right up with lifestyle factors. That's the relationship that we use today to connect life and disease. But again, it's not helping us get any closer to really understanding, well, how does a living system create disease? Or what is going on that it is emerging from a living system? How is disease itself a condition of life? We're all locked up in this risk factor notion of exposures, lifestyle choices, and other conditions that sort of wear down a living system, but they don't come together in any reliable way to explain why disease ends up becoming a common output. This goes into things that happen in life, like events and stress and illness, more on risk factors. But the net result is the relationship between life and disease is risk factors. That's the current paradigm. One more question I ask is, can you understand disease without understanding life? The result launches right into what you should know about undiagnosed rare diseases. That didn't really answer my question. So, top 5 reasons to study rare and undiagnosed diseases, living with rare conditions, understanding your illness, the painful puzzle of diseases that have no name. Again, not answering my question. I tried a different web browser that links to this Nature article. Is it useful to understand disease through Husserl's transcendental phenomenology? Wow. This was published in Humanities and Social Sciences Communications in 2024 by Woo-Sok Choi, who works in integrated medical humanities. First, what is phenomenology? It's a philosophical and research method that studies the nature of human experience, particularly how people perceive and communicate those experiences. So again, this is talking more about the subjective experience of disease, which has no bearing on objective disease as we see it today. This is the other side of mind-body dualism, which today creates a very deep divide. It's impossible to overcome. I had never heard of Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. Edmund Husserl was an Austrian-German philosopher and mathematician in the late 19th and early 20th century who developed this philosophical approach to understanding human experience. Let's check out this article from philarchive.org, which sounds like a philosophical organization. So phenomenology is foundational for all of philosophy, involves consciousness. So again, we're on the subjective side of mind-body dualism. So this gets into very philosophical principles, which basically say that his point of view was over-objectifying our understanding of life is not going to lead to the answers we seek. Back to this article of interest, is it useful to understand disease through this philosophical notion that consciousness and the subjective elements can't be understood in an overly objective interpretation? This is pretty deep. And we are immediately lost in a deep philosophical conversation that really is trying to answer what is disease while also recognizing that we can't really answer what is life. All of that came from the very simple internet query of, can you understand disease without understanding life? The short answer is no. But this illustrates exactly what happens in the paradigm today. You ask a question and you start getting out towards the edge of the paradigm and it starts peeling back on itself into all of these common questions and complex discussions without actually answering the question. That's because we can't answer the question. Now, even though we don't understand life and can't define what it is, we still have been able to make an impact on disease. That is for sure. People are living longer today than they were 100 years ago. We do have interventions that work for some people sometimes. My point is that when we understand life and therefore can actually understand disease, what we're doing today is going to look so backwards. Even though we have some successes compared to where we could be with understanding of life and disease is so far apart it's unimaginable. That we come to the same problems over and over despite web browsers and internet searches indicates that we're out at the edge of the paradigm and facing a question that no one can answer. That's a paradigm problem, not a problem related to being smart or insightful or intellectual. It's time to break down those barriers that are creating that reinforcing effect that brings us back into this complexity and avoids what should be simple questions. what is life and what is disease as a condition of life cannot be answered in today's paradigm. To conclude, we don't really understand the relationship between life and disease as a condition of life. Disease arises from living systems for some reason, but it's actually not completely unique to just living systems. We see similar features of disease in non-living systems because everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end in some way. The reason I bring this up is because when we're trying to understand disease and why we cannot reliably reverse or cure chronic diseases in people, it comes back to a more fundamental problem that we don't understand life. What is life? What does it mean to be living? That today it gets split off into what objectively it means to be alive versus the experience of being alive that don't overlap, ends up arbitrarily separating phenomenon into two things that don't actually exist from the one thing that when they're together does exist. So how do you think of them together as one and not trying to knit them together after the fact? This is such a fundamental problem and so important to understanding disease that I dedicate an entire playlist to exploring it called On Life. We really dive into why we can't understand what life is, and it goes very deep in our understanding. It is a theoretical and philosophical problem, but we don't need to get sucked back into these deep philosophical issues that end up creating their own spirals of confusion that just replace the spiral of confusion we're trying to solve. Something is fundamentally broken in between that connects disease and life. And I think it has a lot to do with the separation between mind and body in today's way of thinking. Only when we know life can we know disease. Does that mean that when we know life, there is no disease? I don't know, but I want to find out. Well, that's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and leave your comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day.